All right. Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, coming to you today through Zoom to talk about bringing in bees and butterflies to the home landscape. And it's a great thing to do. One of the things that we add to our landscapes just by having a garden, really any kind of garden whatsoever, whether it's an ornamental garden or a vegetable garden, a small container garden, those gardens are going to be able to support some wildlife, bring that into our landscape. And so not only do we get to enjoy the plants that are part of that garden, but we also get to enjoy the wildlife that can come along with that. And it's important that we go back and we think about, some comments we've made in a previous presentation where we talked about what the basic needs of wildlife are. And it's a short list. There's only a few things that we need to make sure that we're doing in order to provide that space for wildlife. What we need is food for them. So we need to provide them with a food source, and that can be a natural food source, ideally. In a lot of cases, we're providing some form of artificial food source. But mostly today, I'm really just going to be talking about natural food sources or plants that are going to support those animals that we're bringing in. Now, we also need to provide water. That's the second really important thing. We need to provide that in a way that's going to be really accessible to the animals that are going to be using it. So having a deep pool may not be the best way to do that. Usually for these small animals, what we need is going to be a really shallow water source that they're going to be able to access. And we also need shelter for them. We need a place where they're going to be able to feel safe and protected so that they're going to have everything that they need there in the landscape. So I want to talk about bees for a little bit. And I'm not going to spend any time today talking about honeybees. Providing space for honeybees is going to be an entirely different presentation. And I hope we're going to get to that in the near future. But I want to talk about the native bees that we have here in Mississippi and in the surrounding states as well. And there is a wide diversity of different bees out there. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the different bees that we might run into. One of the really important groups of bees are the mason bees. Now, unlike honeybees, these are a solitary bee. They don't form large hives. They're just going to be individual bees, and they tend to build their nests into hollow twigs or holes that might have been created by a wood boring bee, and then they use mud or plant material to actually construct compartments in that nest, and that use of mud or other material like that is how they get that name mason bees. So if you take a look down at the picture of that bee, that is a really hairy bee. And mason bees are really fuzzy. They really do a great job as pollinators because it's so easy for them to take pollen from one flower to another. Another great thing about mason bees is, people get the impression, bees might be really ready to sting somebody. That's not even the case with honeybees. But mason bees and the other native bees that we're talking about are very docile, very safe to be around. And it's very easy to construct boxes that we can place in the garden that are going to be able to support these bees, provide them a place to nest. And in just a little bit, I'm going to show you a couple of designs for different bee boxes that we can make that will bring these bees into the landscape. Of course, bumblebees are another bee that we might run into. Sometimes it can be a little bit easy to confuse these with the carpenter bee. And the basic way of telling them apart is if you look at the abdomen or the rear end of the bee, on a bumblebee, that's going to be fuzzy. It's going to have those hairs on it. In a carpenter bee, it's going to be really smooth and shiny. Bumblebees will construct their nests underground. Sometimes they will construct nests in abandoned buildings, but they don't make really large nests like you would see out of a honeybee. You may have 200 or 300 bees, which seems like a lot of bees, but when you compare that to honeybees that have much, much larger numbers, the nests for these bumblebees are quite small. Um, those nests are only used for a single year, and then they move on. And bumblebees are really easy to see. They tend to fly very slowly. They're going to be covered in that black and yellow hair, and they feed on pollen collected onto their hind legs. You can see that in the picture there on the top, that pollen that's packed around that hind leg. And they are very good pollinators. In fact, they're used in greenhouse production of some vegetables because they're so great at pollinating those plants. Another bee that we might run into has a little bit of an unfortunate name. We call them sweat bees. And they get their name because they are very attracted to human perspiration. So if you're out in your garden and it's a little warm and you've worked up a sweat because gardening is really great exercise, you may see one of these bees flying around you. It might even land on you because it's attracted to that sweat. And luckily, like mason bees and these other native bees, sweat bees are very passive, and you don't tend to have problems with them stinging. There are a lot of species of sweat bees in the United States, around 1,000 species here in North America. And they can be very brightly colored. Sometimes they're this nice metallic green. Sometimes they're brown or yellow, but they're an insect we are going to see pretty often in our gardens. And they'll nest either in the ground or in the wood. And because there's a lot of species, there's a lot of variation in how they nest. So some of them are solitary and some of them do have more than one bee in a particular nest. Last one I'm going to mention really quickly is the digger bee. Digger bees are named because they do dig holes down into the ground. You can see a picture of one coming out of its ground hole or ground nest there. And they particularly like really dry, well-drained soils. And often when you see these in the landscape, it's not going to be one little nest there. You'll see an area with quite a few of these digger bees having set up shop. So they're really great for pollinating, particularly early spring blooming flowers. The females go in and make those nests, and occasionally I do get calls because people are bothered. They're worried about the bees, damaging their landscape. Actually, having those bees digging down into the landscape can be beneficial because after they're gone, it kind of improves the air and water and nutrient movement through that soil. It kind of loosens it up. Again, really passive bees, great pollinators, so a good organism to have there in the landscape. Now, particularly for mason bees, we can build houses to accommodate them and give them a place to nest there in our landscape. And we can construct those houses a couple of different ways. And there on the left, you see a kind of a cone shape or a cylinder shape that has some cane cut. And that cane can be of varying different diameters down to being quite small up to the largest cane you can find. And make sure we hollow that out so it's just a hollow tube. And we can wrap that and hang that in a place in the garden that is going to have kind of partial shade, generally about 5 feet up the ground. And the mason bees will come along and find that area. And that to them is just a really nice place to nest. It's already dug for them. And so they'll start out, they'll lay their eggs in there. They'll cap that over with that mud or plant material. That again, that's how they get their name. And that just provides them a place to nest. So they're really likely to be there in your garden. Another kind of simpler way of approaching building a bee house is to just use a large block of wood. I recommended getting a 6x6 board or a 6x6 pole and drilling holes through it, just using a power drill. Use different bit sizes so that you have different size holes, and drill all the way through that block so that it goes straight through the block. You can see right through it. And then what I'll do is I'll put a 2x4 on the back of it and put that again, or a 2x6 on the back of it, put that up in again, a place with partial shade about 5 feet off the ground. And that's going to be a really good place to have that bee box or bee house. And it's going to be a very simple bee house to construct. Now, the reason I want to put that 2x6 on the back is, of course, I want that hole to have an end. But I also want to be able to access that. So at the end of the year, when the bees are no longer using that bee house, I want to be able to take that cane or take that big block of wood and clean out all those holes just using a drill again. And that way I can just reuse the thing. And it can be a great shelter for bees from year to year. Of course, that covers shelter, but we also want to make sure that we have good food in the environment for our bees. And there are a lot of flowers that are just going to present a really good food source for them, ranging from small annual herbaceous plants all the way up to large trees in our landscape. Some plants that I really like to include that are really great flowers for me is, of course, basil, which is a very easy herb to grow. Rosemary, again, an herb that's going to be really simple, very low maintenance. Wild bergamot, I just enjoy the flowers on that. Guara has become more popular. I've seen that a lot more at different nurseries as a popular plant to include in the home landscape. And again, that goes all the way up to our larger trees like American hollies. One thing I would like to include, and I'll probably say this again, bees and butterflies really love herb gardens. So having an herb garden there in your landscape is a wonderful way to support both bees and butterflies. The flowers, again, talking about basil as a wonderful food source for bees. But also things like chives and thyme, catmint or catnip for that matter, all of the different kinds of mint, parsley is not only going to through those flowers be a really good source of food for the adult, for the bees, and for the butterflies, but a lot of these plants are also going to be food sources for caterpillars, which are of course what are going to turn into the butterflies we enjoy so much. Now, one thing that we do often ignore when we're talking about bees, particularly, is we kind of look over all of the trees that are in an environment that are wonderful for food for bees. I have a couple of really large magnolia trees in my backyard, along with my beehive. And southern magnolia is, I constantly see the bees up there in those flowers. They have those really nice, large, showy blooms. They're going to show up in April and persist for a good long time. And of course, there are smaller varieties of magnolia that aren't going to get 40 or 60 foot tall. So they can fit in, a lot of different areas in our environment. Now, pollination for magnolias is really more often done by beetles. But the bees really enjoy their pollen, and it works as a great food source for them. And it's worth our time to note that while we love our southern magnolias, there's also the sweet bay magnolia, and even the cucumber tree and big leaf magnolia that have the opportunity to present a little bit, a different appearance in the landscape. Another favorite tree of mine is the red maple. Of course, I really like it because it gives us that nice fall foliage, wonderful red color that we can see in our landscape. They can get quite large. And of course, those male trees are going to have those pink flowers in late winter to early spring. It's really going to be one of the earliest potential nectar sources for bees. And so sometimes it's actually going to flower a little too early for them. But as we, if we have a year where it gets warm pretty quick and the bees are out foraging, it is a wonderful food source for them. And it works well as an understory tree where you have some larger trees. You can then have that red maple underneath them, not only to add some appearance to the landscape, but also as a food source for the bees. Another popular landscape tree is red buckeye. It's really a large shrub, grows up to about 8 feet. Usually in the landscape, though, if you encounter one out in the wild, it can be quite a bit larger than that. It does like some shade in the afternoon, and it produces those really nice tubular florets right on the end of branches, usually from March to May. That's going to be a little bit dependent on where you're listening from. And we'll often see bumblebees on them and carpenter bees on them, but we will see other visitors as well. And it's a wonderful sort of dual purpose plant or three purpose plant because not only are we getting an attractive plant, not only are we providing food for bees, but it's also a plant that's going to be really attractive to hummingbirds and to butterflies. I did mention holly as well a little bit earlier. Of course, American holly can be quite a large tree. Fortunately, it's a tree that really don't have to do too much maintenance on, which makes it a really good plant for an area of the landscape where you just don't want to fool with it. And of course, when we're thinking about holly, we always think about the berries that are going to be on there. But it does actually produce some flowers, and you can see a bee feeding at those flowers there in that picture. Tend to bloom earlier in the year from March, even on into June, and is just a really good food source for bees. In addition to the American holly, particularly down here in South Mississippi, we have the yaupon holly, which is a very common native plant that we see out along roadsides, and we also see it in landscapes. Again, sometimes it's used as a hedge. Also, a really good food source for bees. And when there's enough of them around, we might actually, if we just have honeybees, we might actually see the bees visiting it so much that it produces almost a pure honey directly from that one tree. Dogwood, another popular landscape tree. Really important that we place this in the right spot in the landscape because it really does need a little bit of shade. Has some difficulties if we plant it right out in the open, but it's hard to say anything bad about those really nice white and pink spring blooms. That white area is actually a bract, kind of like a poinsettia. And so you see that small flower there down at the center of the plant that the bee is actually going to be feeding on. But a beautiful plant for the landscape as well as a great plant for bees. Now, my altogether favorite right here is the redbud. Redbud is another native tree. We often see these along roadsides. Tends to be a smaller tree in the landscape, anywhere from 15 to 30 feet. And again, a really good understory plant or a really good plant to put along a border in the landscape. Produces those really nice purple flowers. There are some other varieties that are white. And again, a really great food source, really great source of nesting material. And again, a source for food for the bees really early in the year, because this is going to be one of the first plants that actually puts out its flowers as we get out of winter. Another great plant is going to be crabapple. It's going to be a small tree, usually about 30 feet in height. We may actually find thickets of these in some areas, and they do tend to prefer partial shade and drier soils. But you can see from that picture there just the ridiculous number of flowers that show up on these crab apples. And so it's a wonderful source for bees. In addition to serving as a food source for other wildlife. And so if you're going to plant these, it is really important. Again, they do prefer drier soils. They do prefer partial shade. So you want to put these in the right spot and make sure we're fertilizing them really well and spacing them out and pruning them maybe a little bit better than we see in that picture there. Make sure that we have good airflow through those branches so we don't wind up with disease problems on it. Now, another great tree is the tulip tree, sometimes called a tulip poplar. This can be a quite large tree. It can get up to about 150 feet. Has that really distinctive foliage shape and has these wonderful large blooms that unfortunately sometimes we don't get to see because they're so far up the tree. But another really important food source for bees of all sorts, including honeybees. Do like areas, and you really have to make sure that your soil is well aerated, that we're not getting really dry conditions. But again, this is one of those plants that not only is it something that's going to support bees, but you're also going to get hummingbirds and swallowtail butterflies coming in because you have this tree there in your landscape. Southern catalpa, there is more than one kind. There's a southern and a northern variety. This one gets up to about 25 to 40 feet. And it's a very bushy plant. It tends to spread out quite a lot. Leaves have really prominent veins and are quite large. Blooms from May into June. Has really attractive flower clusters that are white, have those yellow and purple markings on them, produce a kind of cigar-like pod. Now, you know, this is a tree that likes to spread, so it's something you want to keep from spreading out. But again, it's a really great food source, particularly for bumblebees and for carpenter bees. The way that I was introduced to this tree, much like many others, I suspect, is because there's a caterpillar that gets onto these trees that is a popular one for fish bait and works fantastically well. So maybe that's an additional reason to have the plant in your landscape. Of course, for bees, it's also a great thing to have some fruit trees around. Not only are you supporting the bees, but the bees are doing a great job of helping you get some fruit in your landscape. Down here in South Mississippi, we do like to have our citrus trees, particularly our kumquats and satsumas and grapefruit. And a lot of them don't really require pollinators, though there are some that do. They tend to put on their flowers from February into March. Mine this year put on their flowers a little early. And bees in large citrus groves are often introduced to increase yields, but those citrus plants put on a lot of flowers and are really beneficial to bees. Persimmon, another great tree, another great fruit tree for here in Mississippi. We have both the oriental persimmons and the native varieties. Those oriental persimmons tend to have a larger fruit, whereas the native varieties really have to be kind of completely ripe and soft before they're really edible. Native persimmons produce either male or female flowers, so they're going to need that pollinator. So bees are really important as pollinators for these persimmon trees. So that's again where we're not only seeing the benefit of having the tree there, but we are supporting the bees at the same time. Pear trees, most of them are not going to be self-fertile, so bees are going to be the most important pollinators. The flowers are not really that attractive because they have a pretty low sugar concentration. They produce a lot of pollen, but not very little nectar. So oftentimes you do see them attracted to flowers around the pears, but they will visit the flowers and they will get that pollen and transfer that from flower to flower. Of course, again, blueberry is a great plant there in the landscape. I'm anxiously awaiting my blueberries being ready. Produces a large number of flowers, and they do require pollination by insects because if we don't have pollination, then we're not going to get really good fruit development. And There is actually a southeastern blueberry bee that is an important pollinator for blueberries. Uh, but bumblebees and other native bees are actually probably more important as pollinators for blueberry than just the southeastern blueberry bee. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some plants that are great for butterflies. There's a long list of flowers that are fantastic for bringing those butterflies into your landscape. And it's important when we think about plants for butterflies that we think about plants that are going to support not only the adults, the butterflies, but also support the caterpillars. So we're also going to talk about plants that are going to support those caterpillars and get them into our landscape. So some plants that do fantastic and bring them in, as well as being really attractive in the landscape, include black-eyed Susan, really nice yellow flowers with that dark center. Gomphrena has that nice globe-like flower. If you've got an area for something to vine on, Angel's Trumpet is really gorgeous, has those really long tubular flowers. And of course, butterfly bush, one of the milkweed species, is going to be a really good source, not only for the adult butterflies, but really important for that one specific butterfly. Cleome, a beautiful flower, has a really distinct kind of shape to it. There's a lot of different kinds of echinacea or coneflower that are really attractive in the landscape. We normally think of that purple color that we get out of that, but there's a lot of color variation, including whites and yellows and reds, that can make a really nice sort of statement in a flower garden. I do enjoy Coreopsis as well. Again, a lot of variation, but a really nice flower. And hibiscus, you know, if we want to talk about a larger plant, hibiscus with those really large flowers does fantastic. I always actually see the butterflies going to my okra plants because hibiscus is a relative, but I have hibiscus as well and often see the butterflies coming to it. Cardinal flower, really nice clusters of red flowers. Verbena, really good as a low growing plant in the landscape. And a personal favorite is Sweet William. Really, again, a lot of different color variations and a really interesting flower shape that works really well in the landscape. So when we look at plants for caterpillars, there are a lot of those as well. You can see dill and fennel and of course milkweed, parsley, passion flower, which I grew up calling maypop, verbena, all wonderful plants to get those caterpillars in. I always do encourage people to, again, have herb gardens because I think that's a great way to keep those caterpillars there. Just kind of tolerate that those caterpillars are going to feed on those herbs a little bit. Herbs are really easy to grow, so it's easy to seed down more than you would need and let those caterpillars go to town. But some other plants like Dutchman's pipe, again, a really interesting flower. Mallows and hollyhocks just produce some really nice blooms, in addition to being a plant that the caterpillar is going to be able to feed on. And if they damage a little bit of the foliage, that's perfectly okay. We still have those really nice flowers. I'm going to talk specifically about milkweed in a second. Of course, passion flower or a maypop is going to be a great vining plant that's going to be, you know, something you can trellis and produces just a fantastic frilly flower. Nasturtiums available in all sorts of different colors. So you can add a lot of variation into the landscape. And verbena is, again, a great low growing plant that the caterpillars are going to enjoy. When we talk about milkweed, one thing that I do want to point out is occasionally we do see people using what's called the tropical milkweed. It's in that same Asclepias genus. It's Asclepias curasavicus. I don't see it quite as much at nurseries now as I have in the past. And I think that's just a good job of awareness being out there, that those tropical milkweeds really aren't the best thing to have in our landscape, because they don't tend to die back in the winter. And because of that, some pathogens that affect monarchs can build up on those plants. So I do encourage you to look for the native milkweeds. Kind of the most common one that we're going to run into is what we call butterfly weed, or Asclepias tuberosa. That is one I do very frequently see at nurseries. But there are a lot of other species out there as well, that can give you all sorts of variation in flower color. Just everything from whites and purples, different different leaf shapes that just add a little bit of variation, and maybe some interest in the landscape, while also providing an important food source not only for the monarch caterpillars, but through their flowers, the monarch adults as well. And so there are quite a few different species of milkweed that are native here. Swamp milkweed, Mishaw's milkweed, white milkweed. You can see a couple of pictures there of some of their flowers. And I would encourage you to look online. Crosby Arboretum has a great page that talks about the different species of milkweed native here in Mississippi. And I would wager that you can also go to Crosby Arboretum at one of their native plant sales, because they often do include milkweed as one of the plants that they have at those sales. And again, you're really supporting those native plant populations and supporting the migration of the monarch butterflies as they come through Mississippi by using these native milkweeds as opposed to that tropical milkweed. Now, with either bees or with butterflies, it is important again to have a water source. Butterflies and even bees are going to use mud puddles or pools on the ground or flat stones in order to get not only water but minerals that they can pick up from that. So including an area in your landscape where you're going to be able to have that small area of standing water is going to be really beneficial to the butterflies and the bees. I really like including them. You can see kind of that hanging plate there in the top picture. Not only is it going to be something that's going to support those butterflies, but it's also a really neat place to be able to go and take a look at them and see them gather. Oftentimes you'll see the butterflies show up in the morning to kind of gather together and drink. So it's a great place to watch butterflies, in addition to providing them that water source. One thing that we will occasionally see are butterfly houses, and really the idea behind these is that they're designed for a hibernation space for the butterflies. So the butterflies that overwinter as adults, and they go into these houses as a protected space, where you would where they would then come out in the spring. And as much as I've looked into these and read what I can about them, and my own personal experience with them is I never actually find butterflies in the butterfly house, and that's backed up with some other experiences. Most of our butterflies are not going to be overwintering as adults. They're going to overwinter either as eggs or as caterpillars. And so while it certainly doesn't hurt anything to have these in the landscape, it's probably not going to be that beneficial for the butterflies either. Most butterflies, when they are going to rest on the shrubs and other landscape plants that are around. Sometimes they'll hole up on the underside of leaves. So providing them that space in the environment is really a lot more important than including these butterfly houses. So if I can be permitted to take a little bit of extra time, I am going to kind of just go through and introduce some of the butterflies that we have here in Mississippi. By no stretch of the imagination an exhaustive list, but just some butterflies I picked out that are here in Mississippi and that you might run into. So Going to start off, this is a red spotted purple or white admiral. I'm not going to trouble you with all the scientific names. Really fond of poplar and oak trees, also on birches and willows as an adult, or rather as a caterpillar. As an adult, tends to feed on rotting fruit or occasionally nectar from white flowers. You might see the adults on privet and viburnum, and actually going after aphid honeydew as well. The Viceroy butterfly, probably best known because it is a mimic of the monarch butterfly. The caterpillar likes plants that are going to be in the willow family, like willows and poplars. And the adults, when they will feed on aphid honeydew, they feed on decaying fungi. Later in the year, they'll feed on plants like goldenrod and Joe Pye weed. So a very common butterfly we might see out in the landscape. And of course, there is always the most famous butterfly of all, the monarch butterfly. Of course, the caterpillar feeds really just on milkweeds. All of the milkweed species here in Mississippi. And the adults also feed on those milkweeds from the flowers. We'll also feed on other plants, including clovers, lantana, goldenrods, blazing star, and tickseed sunflower. The hackberry emperor butterfly. Of course, the caterpillar is going to be seen on a bunch of different kinds of hackberry or sugarberry. The adults like sap and, again, rotting fruit. Occasionally, you will see them taking moisture at spots along roads and streams. Often, you'll see several at one time. The tawny emperor caterpillars like the elm trees, all sorts of different elm trees, whereas the adults, again, tree sap and rotting fruit are really common foods for these adult butterflies, not one that you very commonly see visiting flowers. This is the goatweed leafwing. I think it's got a really interesting leaf, interesting wing shape there. Does feed as a caterpillar on goatweed and prairie tea, other spurge type plants, whereas the adults mostly on sap and rotting fruit and other unfortunate things. This is the Diana fritillary. It's one of many of the fritillaries we have here in Mississippi. Caterpillars are very fond of violets, whereas the adults, again, they're going to be feeding on those milkweeds, particularly common milkweed and swamp milkweed, red clover, butterfly bush, all great plants to include for this butterfly. Another fritillary, the great spangled fritillary. Again, violets are going to be a great plant to include for this caterpillar. And adults are going to be feeding much the same way on milkweeds and bergamot, red clover, Joe Pye weed, and the coneflowers or echinacea species. A very common butterfly down here in the southern part of the state. Also one we'll see other areas. Caterpillars are very common on passion flower or passion vine. The entire Passiflora genus. Adults will take nectar from lantana, shepherd's needle, and a variety of other plants. This is the variegated fritillary. I just ran into, someone sent me a picture of one of their chrysalises, so the cocoon of one. And they are very selective. They really like those maypops or Passiflora species. Will also feed on violets. The adults, butterfly weed, other milkweeds, mints, and clover, really good food sources for them. This is the zebra heliconian. Again, Passiflora, the maypop or passion flower for caterpillars. Flower, nectar, and pollen. Interesting thing about them is they like to have kind of a set route for their feeding. so you'll see them patrolling back and forth, particularly common around lantana plants. Here is the queen butterfly, just a little bit of a step down from the monarch in that same genus. Feeds also on the milkweeds and milkweed vines. Same sort of feeding as an adult. Interesting butterfly because it has that long snout, really kind of an understated one. Has that kind of interesting head shape. Really feeds on the hackberry as a caterpillar, and you can find them on things like goldenrod, asters, and dogbane as an adult. This is the American lady. Caterpillars are common on sunflowers, all sorts of different plants, plantain leaf, pussy toes, and wormwood, and ironwood, and burdock, all common caterpillar hosts. The adult feeds, again, goldenrod, marigolds are a good plant for them, and they'll also feed on milkweed. This is the common buckeye. Really has those dramatic eye spots. The caterpillars like snapdragons, as well as other plants that are in that same group. Also feed on plantain or plantain. Adults like chicory and tickseed sunflower, as well as peppermint, which would probably be the choice I would make for my landscape. Just going to show just a few more of these, just kind of as an example. I'm not going to read out each one to you. That's the Gorgon checker spot. See these on sunflowers. The adults prefer yellow flowers. This is the painted lady. A lot of different caterpillar hosts for these, and feed on all sorts of different plants as adults. Blazing star and Joe Pye weed would be really common. Also the clovers, particularly red clover, milkweed. Great wing shape here. This is the question mark butterfly. Caterpillars will be found on elm trees, Japanese hop, false nettles. Another plant that another butterfly that tends to feed on things like rotting fruit and tree sap, but also something that you might find if you have milkweed in your landscape. Just going to go through these real quick just to show you the pictures, just to kind of identify some of the butterflies that you might run into in your landscape. Really like this one. I think it's just a gorgeous butterfly. Really interesting colors to it. Again, kind of an understated. They're not all really just jumping with colors. Sometimes you get these butterflies that have kind of a little bit more understated appearance. And then we get to our swallowtails, which are quite large butterflies and tend to be really sort of easy to see in our landscape. Caterpillars usually going to be found on trees like sweet bay or tulip trees, birches and ashes. The adults love wild cherry and lilac. They'll also go to our milkweed plants and Joe Pye weed. So great reason to have those in the landscape. The giant swallowtail I more often run into as a caterpillar than I do as an adult. The caterpillars are commonly seen on our citrus trees. They have an appearance that kind of looks like bird leavings. Makes them a little bit easy to look over, but we do get those caterpillars on those trees. They don't really do enough damage to matter. Adults, again, really dramatic butterfly, feed on lantanas and azaleas, goldenrod, and milkweed in the landscape. Another swallowtail. This is a really great, some black with that blue coloration. Does like to feed on a spice bush as an immature, but also tulip trees and sweet bay and red bay trees. Will take nectar from honeysuckle, milkweeds, and azaleas, lantana. So a lot of different flowers in the landscape. Another of the swallowtails with that interesting sort of stripe coloration, zebra swallowtail. This is the silver spotted skipper. Skippers are kind of a special group or a smaller group in the butterflies. Often see these on plants like honey locust or false indigo as caterpillars. I run into them occasionally, or I used to run into them occasionally in soybean fields as immatures. Prefers blue and red, pink, purple flowers. For some reason, it just doesn't like yellow flowers.